Good morning, Your Excellencies, Your Grace, Madam Chair, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you in particular to the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences for inviting me to speak here today, and thank you to Bishop Marcello and Professor Archer for your vision on this issue. I've met with some of you here before in my previous role as the head of London's Metropolitan Police Human Trafficking Unit. And I'm here today, as Professor Archer says, in my new role as the United Kingdom's first ever independent anti-slavery commissioner, as appointed by the Home Secretary. I could say it's a privilege to hold this role, but sadly, the role should not need to exist in the 21st century, so privilege is not the right term. However, it is an honour to serve, and as Cardinal Vincent Nichols, the Archbishop of Westminster, has said, we should be grateful for the gift of service. So for this gift of service, I'm indeed extremely privileged, as this position allows me to lead the role in service for others, the vulnerable and marginalised in our society. And I intend to do all I can to protect and support the victims, disrupt the criminality, and bring to justice those who perpetrate these crimes and inflict this abuse of human dignity. Once there are laws and criminalisation, many are often less focused on what must happen next, not understanding that this is only the very first step. Once there are legal frameworks, there needs to be an understanding and a common agreement, and my role is very much about developing that understanding, but also moulding and spearheading a response that works in practice, not just in the statute books or in the clinical space of a courtroom, or indeed just in the lecture theatre. As Professor Archer's preface to this plenary session makes clear, there are two statements that Pope Francis has consistently repeated from the beginning of his pontificate, one of which is that human trafficking is modern slavery. I think it's very important that we use this term, modern slavery, and I'm pleased that the British government is, I believe, the first government in the world to formally adopt it, although President Obama has also personally shown great leadership in this regard. Previously, in the United Kingdom, modern slavery crimes had been described as forms of human trafficking. But trafficking as a term implicitly indicates movement, and whilst people are often trafficked to be abused, it is the actual exploitation and loss of freedom that we should be most concerned with. It is the enslavement of our fellow citizens. And I'm also struck by how much the term modern slavery actually shocks those for whom slavery had long settled into the minds as being categorically a thing of the past. Make no mistake, slavery is very much alive and well in the 21st century, not just in the developing world, but in our so-called advanced communities and economies, such as in the United Kingdom. I want to give you examples of shocking exploitation that I encountered on a daily basis during my previous life as a police officer. Unfortunately, these are just a few of many hundreds that I could cite. The Romanian Cinderella, as the media named her, who at the age of 4 was taken from her mother in Romania, believing her daughter was destined for a better life in the United Kingdom, including a good education. How wrong she was. For the next 3 years, this small and defensive child was kept as a servant, forced to cook and clean, and never allowed to attend school. Her only possessions were the clothes on her back, and her health deteriorated dramatically. Or the vulnerable British man, offered a job at a farm, only to then be coerced into forced labour, working all hours of the week for no pay, being regularly beaten, and living in a rat-infested shed. Or the Tanzanian woman hired on a legitimate visa, only for her wealthy sponsor to take her passport away upon arrival in the United Kingdom and keep her locked in a house. She was forced to carry out household chores and beaten. And George, a 57-year-old man from Romania who expected to be given work as an electrician on his arrival to the United Kingdom. Instead, he was forced to commit crimes for criminals that controlled him, kept him in a shed, and rarely fed him. On one occasion, when he asked for food, he was instead assaulted and raped. In all these cases, the perpetrators were brought to justice, and all the victims are on the road to recovery. It was not easy, but it is possible. Recent analysis conducted by the United Kingdom Home Office, our Interior Ministry, estimates conservatively that there are between 10 and 13,000 potential victims trapped in slavery across the United Kingdom. We know that some exploiters are opportunist individuals, but much of this crime is organised, particularly when it crosses national borders, though the degree of organisation of the criminal networks varies greatly, with more recent evidence showing a proliferation of loose criminal networks. And this crime does not exist in a vacuum. Many of the groups behind modern slavery crime will also be carrying out other serious crimes. This plenary session is, of course, focused on issues beyond criminalisation, and I want to talk today about that. For me, the key is balance and harmonisation. In my new role, I will be focused on ensuring that all the efforts in the United Kingdom strike such a balance between unrelenting pursuit and prosecution of traffickers and slave drivers, but in tandem with a much greater focus to support and restore the dignity of the victims, including long-term reintegration. The slavery we see today exists for the same purpose as it has throughout history: to maximise profit for exploiters by minimising or eliminating the cost of labour. The International Labour Organization estimates that the total illegal profits obtained from modern slavery crime worldwide amounts to over $150 billion per year. Indeed, the two primary factors driving increases in this crime are high profit and low risk. A big part of my role is to focus on that risk factor. We know that criminals are risk adverse. Globally, it has certainly been a low-risk crime. The United Nations report that between 2010 and 2012, almost half the countries around the world reported less than 10 convictions per year. So across the globe, it is crucial that we improve our national, regional, and international collaborative efforts to pursue the criminals. At the moment, it is far too easy to get away with this crime, which only encourages it as a criminal activity. And crucially, if traffickers and slave drivers aren't properly pursued and brought to justice, they will, of course, continue to exploit countless other vulnerable people. The suffering of our fellow man must be addressed. To achieve this, improved international cooperation is absolutely vital. One of my key priorities as Commissioner is to push for a significant increase in bilateral and multilateral joint investigation teams operating across the globe. I had the opportunity to lead on many of these operations in my previous role. They are crucial when dealing with organised crime groups that operate across national borders. As an example, several years ago, my police unit was able to break up a criminal gang involved in sham marriages and the trafficking of over 100 vulnerable women, mainly from Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland to the United Kingdom for forced prostitution. 12 arrests were made in the United Kingdom and abroad, assets seized, and 9 convictions and 3 cautions eventually secured. Numerous women were rescued from slavery. The activities of this ruthless gang would almost certainly have gone on to exploit others had they not been stopped. But also included in that operation were Caritas, the Mercy Sisters, as well as police forces from the relevant countries and other countries where activities had taken part. Joint investigation teams are approved and funded by the European Union's judicial agency, Eurojust, in explicit recognition of the new transnational crime landscape that has emerged across Europe in recent years. This landscape is increasingly characterised by highly mobile and flexible groups operating in different EU states and criminal sectors. Criminal networks and their activities are becoming more and more international. Criminals can now book flights in minutes, and through EU freedom of movement rules and the expansion of the EU, and of course the proliferation of cheap airlines, the whole of Europe is now their playground. This trend, of course, calls for strengthened border cooperation and for more joint operations involving police, customs, border officials and judicial authorities in different EU states. I met just last month with the president of Eurojust, and she would very much welcome greater use of international instruments allowing joint work. And we should also think creatively about how to widen the type of collaboration that is possible in Europe to the rest of the world. Mutual legal assistance treaties need to be fit for purpose and work at a speed that responds to the risk to life. And tackling the criminals behind modern slavery requires a modern response that makes use of modern tools and techniques. Just as traffickers use technology and the internet to recruit and advertise their victims, I will be pushing to make certain that in the United Kingdom we utilise technology to tackle them. I am working with colleagues in the United States to ensure that the United Kingdom is at the forefront of partnership working that is coming out of President Obama's Big Data Initiative. This will enable us to pilot cutting-edge tools, allowing law enforcement to uncover a wealth of information that might otherwise be difficult or time-intensive to obtain. Crime groups can then be easily identified and cross-referenced with law enforcement databases, helping police officers map connections between modern slavery and other illegal activity. I have agreement to pilot this in the United Kingdom for sex trafficking and also for forced labour exploitation. And I'm very pleased that the United Kingdom Gangmasters Licensing Authority have agreed to be the first labour inspectorate in the world to pilot this new software for forced labour crime. Forced labour is now very nearly as prevalent in the United Kingdom as trafficking for sexual exploitation. Yet in many parts of Europe and globally, there is no way near the same focus on this form of exploitation compared to sex trafficking, possibly due to mindsets, culture, or a lack of suitable legislation. And I cannot talk about criminalisation without mentioning the United Kingdom's new Modern Slavery Act, which was passed last month with royal assent from Her Majesty the Queen. This landmark act is an indication of the British government's ambition to take a global lead in the fight against slavery and trafficking, as we did in the days of William Wilberforce in the 1800s. I will just provide a brief overview, as I know that Professor McEldowney will be discussing the genesis of this legislation tomorrow. Previously, in the United Kingdom, slavery and human trafficking offences were contained in a number of different acts. The government has therefore decided to consolidate and simplify existing legislation and making it into one single act to make it easier for enforcement and prosecutors to understand and apply. The Act includes two substantive modern slavery offences, one for slavery, servitude and forced or compulsory labour, and one for human trafficking. The human trafficking offence reflects the international definition of human trafficking as set out in the Palermo Protocol, but it goes further also with a raft of new measures. And it will ensure that perpetrators receive suitably severe punishments for these appalling crimes by increasing the maximum sentence to one of life imprisonment. But we know that in most cases of this crime, the criminals are motivated by profit, and an even greater disincentive is to hit them where it hurts, financially. In the United Kingdom, we are determined to become much more effective at attacking the illicit profits of traffickers and slave drivers through greater use of asset recovery and financial investigation tools. The Act will make both modern slavery offences what we describe as criminal lifestyle offences, which will make perpetrators subject to the most robust confiscation regime available under the United Kingdom's Proceeds of Crime Act. This permits the court to treat all the assets that a defendant has or has had in the last 6 years as proceeds of crime. Over £2 million has been recovered from traffickers in the United Kingdom over the past 4 years, but I am clear that this figure needs to rise dramatically. And I am pleased that the British government is clear that the first priority for assets recovered is for them to go to the victims by creating new reparation orders to ensure that money from convicted slave drivers and traffickers goes direct to the victims. And prevention and risk orders can be used before crimes take place. These will actually stop the offenders before they commit the crimes and, in themselves, can attract custodial penalties. Those are some of the key clauses focused on the criminals. Initially, there was some fear that the legislation would focus too heavily on criminalisation without addressing the needs of the victims. But in no small part, due to the rigorous pre-legislative scrutiny process, which included an evidence review chaired by a distinguished Member of Parliament, which in fact took evidence from the first plenary session of the Pontifical Academy in late 2013, followed up by an unprecedented Joint Select Committee of both Houses of Parliament, I am pleased to say that the final version of the Act is much closer to the harmonised response to this issue that I spoke of. Together, the evidence review and the Joint Committee took evidence from hundreds of witnesses, including non-governmental organisations, shelters, faith groups, academics, police, prosecutors, international partners and other officials. Measures to enhance support for victims run throughout the Act. Morally, this is of course absolutely necessary, and evidence from across the globe makes it clear that without effective support for victims, it is very difficult to increase the numbers of prosecutions, as victims must be made to feel safe and confident enough to come forward and give their accounts. Special measures will be extended to all victims of modern slavery to ensure that they have the necessary protections whilst acting as witnesses in courts, such as screening from offenders and giving their evidence in private. A new statutory defence for victims of modern slavery will mean that the victims of these crimes who have been compelled to commit offences as a direct consequence of their slavery situation can be confident they will not be treated as criminals by the criminal justice system. There have been too many instances where the victims have been wrongly prosecuted and have in effect therefore been twice victimised by both the criminal and then by the state. The government is also trialling specialist independent advocates to support child victims of trafficking. And crucially, there is also an enabling power to place the United Kingdom's framework for identifying victims of modern slavery and ensuring they receive the appropriate protection and support, the national referral mechanism, on a statutory footing following much-needed reform of the process. This will be important in ensuring greater consistency in its operation, decision-making and provision of support services. I will be focusing on ensuring that the reform process provides the support that is much better at restoring the dignity of the victims and that focuses on their long-term healing and reintegration into society. In few other crimes are human beings used as commodities over and over again for the gain of others. Victims endure experiences that are horrifying in their inhumanity, including violence, rape, hunger, and abuse. And these are individuals who have often experienced other forms of abuse, exploitation, and poverty or poor health prior to having been enslaved. Their vulnerabilities are multiplied many times over by their experience at the hands of their traffickers and slave drivers. Stripped of their freedom and often exploited for profit, the damage inflicted on victims is incalculable. A serious issue raised by a wide range of individuals from the voluntary sector, and indeed the police, is the lack of continued support and reintegration of assistance in the United Kingdom. So I am committed to ensuring that the support in the United Kingdom is better focused on ensuring that victims receive the support they need in order to rebuild their lives and increase their resilience. This support should include access to training and education, as well as emotional and psychological support and therapeutic care. Vocational training is an important element to include in reintegration plans as a means of ensuring the sustainable society, a sustainable social integration of victims by increasing their future employment prospects, confidence, and life skills. This can lead to independent financial support, a sense of control of reintegration, a sense of worth and capacity, which can assist mental rehabilitation, a contribution to community, which can often offset any alienation or stigma, and an inherent protection from vulnerability to industries or work susceptible to re-victimization. Helping victims to become more self-sufficient is also crucial in reducing the need for them to leave their communities to find work abroad and run the risk of being re-trafficked. It was with this in mind that I have been partnering with the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales over recent years. We did not want to wait for legislation to develop a response. Whilst I may be biased, the work of the Bishops' Conference is, I would suggest, an outstanding model, and indeed, I may say, the very epitome of the response to this serious crime of modern slavery. The Bishops' Conference, under the wise stewardship of Cardinal Nichols and Bishop Patrick Lynch, have listened carefully to the need for a holistic response to the evil of modern slavery. But listening is not enough. Have we heard this morning? Action is what is required. When I first met with Bishop Patrick Lynch of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary, I recall him saying that he wanted more than another leaflet in the back of the church. He wanted to see a real tangible response. That was a clear message of intent to deliver. Bishop Pat identified the need for a strategy and consolidation in the church. He then spoke to his fellow bishops, and at their annual plenary, they unanimously agreed that the feast day of St. Josephine Bakhita would be dedicated as a day of prayer in England and Wales. And we now know, with the assistance of Sister Eugenia, that this day is dedicated globally by the Catholic Church. As the migration lead, Bishop Patrick Lynch asked his team to develop a comprehensive plan for the church, looking at prevention, support, reintegration, and bringing perpetrators to justice. This has now developed into Project Bakhita. A key element of this is a centre in London that provides holistic support to victims, where they will receive the support needed outside of any government provisions or limitations. This is linked to education, employment opportunities, and all the elements to deliver real recovery. The key ingredient is, of course, the love and compassion they are shown to allow them to reconnect as human beings. And that's why the adoratrices are leading on the pastoral care, as their order is formed on the charism of supporting victims of modern slavery and those caught in prostitution. But the centre does not work in isolation. It also aims to achieve the balanced response, again including a focus on pursuing the criminals. So one of the key integrated partners is the police, who are focused on the concept of the golden hour, where the support workers will quickly as possible share key information which they have gathered from the victims in a safe, secure and non-threatening environment. The police teams will then use this information to pursue the criminals and stop them from exploiting others. And Project Bakhita will introduce host families from communities and parishes who will provide a home at the right time for victims who may need care and comfort of a family setting. As this illustrates, combating modern slavery, of course, requires the expertise, resources and efforts of many different individuals and entities. Central to this must be close working between those who pursue the criminals and those that support the victims. As the United Kingdom Anti-Slavery Commissioner, a key priority will be to encourage close partnership working between statutory agencies, including law enforcement and non-government organisations. I believe that faith groups and non-government organisations are crucial partners in the fight against modern slavery. We know that in cases where victims are controlled by their traffickers, often the only place they are allowed to go without close scrutiny is the local church or place of worship. Foreign national victims are often very wary of the authorities in the United Kingdom and find it hard to trust them for fear of what might happen to them as told to them by their traffickers. So when I headed up the London's Metropolitan Police team, I put a great deal of effort into forging unique victim-centred partnerships with faith groups, including the Catholic Church. This allowed us to work closely with people of faith whose victims would be much more likely to trust and who, in many cases, had the right skills in terms of providing the support the victims may need. Working with the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Bernard Hogan Howe, and His Eminence, Cardinal Vincent Nichols, we were able to take this best practice model to the highest levels, and in April 2014 launched the Santa Marta Group here at the Pontifical Academy, with thanks to Bishop Sanchez Sorondo. This is a very unusual group, bringing together bishops and police leaders from across the world, over 30 countries so far, working together with civil society to eradicate modern slavery in a process endorsed by Pope Francis. The first conference resulted in a signed declaration of commitment by all police chiefs present to work together on the international stage to develop effective partnership strategies. The objective of the group is to combine the resources of the Catholic Church with those of law enforcement agencies to prevent modern slavery, to provide pastoral care to victims, and to support them with long-term reintegration. A number of practical projects are now developed under the Santa Marta umbrella, which bring together source, transit, and destination countries, including a piece of work looking at the exploitation of vulnerable men in the fishing industry in the North Atlantic. But this is extended now to the Philippines, and having met with Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines, he is now a partner of that project and is also a member of the Santa Marta Group. Working with Missio, the Church's charity for overseas missions, we are also currently developing a pilot project in Edo State in Nigeria that aims to bring a host of partners together on the ground to prevent the trafficking of huge numbers of young women and girls into sexual exploitation in Western Europe that is currently taking place. And all projects developed through the Santa Marta Group will be focused around partnership working between source, transit, and destination countries. That will include local and regional partners, the police, United Nations bodies, and of course, faith and civil society. This has now been reported to the nuncio at the United Nations in New York, Archbishop Azur, and this is now going to be showcased as a model of best practice by the United Nations. I often hear, but how can we do this in our country? We do not have the same relationships. We have corruption and mistrust. Well, I understand these issues, but let's find the leaders. Let's see who is up to the mark to develop the trust between the Church and other agencies. Pope Francis himself has never been shy to show such leadership. And if anyone had suggested to me 5 years ago that all this was possible, I would not even have understood the concept. So I will take this opportunity to publicly thank Cardinal Vincent, Bishop Patrick, and their team, especially Mrs. Taylor Kamara and Dr. David Ryle, for their leadership, compassion, and openness of spirit. This is the process of changing the minds. I do not have time today to focus on the issues of demand, but this is, of course, a key area that needs bold thinking. And as Professor Archer has said, and I look forward to hearing from other speakers, this is a very important subject. What I will say is that modern slavery is taking place in businesses and supply chains of companies located in the United Kingdom and across the developed world, and also, of course, in international supply chains of multinational companies. It is vital that we focus on the slavery that we in the United Kingdom and other developed countries might be unwittingly creating the demand for. The United Kingdom is therefore introducing a legal duty on businesses above a certain turnover to disclose each year the steps they have taken to ensure that modern slavery does not take place in their business or supply chains anywhere in the world. The United Kingdom is the first country in the world to introduce such legislation, though it has been modelled on state legislation introduced in California, where the evidence suggests that it is being positively responded to and changing corporate behaviour. Here, the media is key and demonstrated last year by a Guardian newspaper investigation into vulnerable Burmese men being used as slaves in the fishing industry in Thailand. The fish were used as fish meal, which was then fed to prawns that were believed to be sold to supermarkets in the United Kingdom and other parts of Europe and the United States. This one investigation changed the public debate on supply chain transparency, though much more needs to be done for the attitudes of the everyday customer. And of course, the Act has introduced my role as the UK Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner to spearhead the response. As the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, I have been afforded a great duty and responsibility. My independence will be unwavering, whether that be towards law enforcement, government, the private sector, or indeed any organisation. And as you might expect, my key aims as Commissioner are to increase the numbers of victims of modern slavery that are identified and referred for appropriate rehabilitative support, and in tandem to increase the numbers of prosecutions and convictions for traffickers and slave masters. And a big focus will also be to improve dramatically efforts to prevent these crimes from occurring in the first place. The Act also makes clear that international collaboration is central to my role. I will be developing partnerships with countries from where significant numbers of traffic victims originate, as well as countries that generally suffer disproportionately from high levels of modern slavery and where the United Kingdom has appropriate assets. I will report annually to the British Parliament across my entire remit and make sure my recommendations are acted upon. Another focus will be to ensure that all the work I have described so far is underpinned by hard research and evidence. This has unfortunately been distinctly lacking in this field to date. So I am delighted to be working with the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales in partnership with St Mary's University, which is developing the Bakita Institute, a pioneering academic centre to conduct applied research. And as this is a Catholic university, the Chancellor has agreed that as many as 10% of the staff, and it currently employs 1,200 people, will be allocated to those who are victims of slavery. Let's hope that not too far away, that includes a lecturer. Many people in the United Kingdom have also been recently talking to me about the need to collect and crunch much more data and intelligence on this crime from a wide variety of sources. And I do often agree with them. But for me, the problem in the UK at the moment is that the best source of intelligence is not being treated properly or supported properly, and that's the victims themselves. They are the people who will be able to tell us what has happened and will be crucial to identify the crime group gangs and prevent the suffering of others. But of course, for this to happen, we need to make sure these crimes are both properly reported and then investigated. Finally, I want to talk about long-term solutions to this crime against humanity, as Pope Francis has described it. I very much support what Professor Archer has said about pushing for the inclusion of a modern slavery and trafficking as a standalone sustainable development goal. It is crucial that this issue is addressed through the goals in order to ensure that holistic responses are fundamentally built into national and international frameworks and aid budgets. As Professor Archer stated, there is still time for negotiation and amendments, and I do believe that the current drafting needs to be improved to ensure that the right level of priority is attached to this issue. I'm delighted that Professor Sachs will be speaking tomorrow on the role of the goals in addressing slavery and trafficking. There is no one on earth who could advise us better. Earlier this week, I attended the United Nations Congress on Crime for the Prevention of Crime and the Criminal Justice System in Doha, where there were some positive developments. The outcome document from the Congress, termed the Doha Declaration, positively acknowledges that sustainable development and the rule of law are strongly interrelated and mutually reinforcing. In reference to the Sustainable Development Goals, the Doha Declaration reiterates the importance of promoting peaceful, corruption-free and inclusive societies for sustainable development, with a focus on a people-centred approach that provides access to justice for all and builds effective, accountable and inclusive institutions at all levels. The Congress itself gave very prominent focus to modern slavery or trafficking in persons, and the Declaration includes comprehensive commitments to specifically address this issue, though more could have been said explicitly on linking it to the Sustainable Development Goals. The re-emergence of slavery in the modern world, sadly, is one of the biggest challenges of our modern globalised society. Increasing levels of migration, demand for cheap labour, and more convoluted transnational supply chains, among other factors in our world of want, have enabled slavery to re-emerge in many senses, sadly, stronger than ever. It is vital to link the market forces that drive modern slavery to the Sustainable Development Goals in order to craft policies that fuel long-term sustained change. I welcome the recent amendment put forward last month to one of the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals to ensure that the goal of eradication of forced labour is applicable to all victims, women, men and children. But there are further improvements that I believe can be made, and certainly we should all aim for a standalone goal. I will also be working to push for them to specifically address the evil of child slavery, as currently references to child labour do not go far enough. If a post-2015 world is to be one where freedom is a reality for all, a holistic approach is needed that addresses the driving forces behind the slave trade and the role that demand plays, whilst also ensuring the protection of all victims, regardless of their background, and that bolsters the ability to prosecute traffickers and bring slave drivers to justice. To finish, I will quote the great British parliamentarian, William Wilberforce, when he spoke of his vision in the face of adversity to criminalise this cruel trade in human life back in the 1800s. This man in Parliament said, "Great indeed are our opportunities. Great also is our responsibility." With the development and the prospect of utilising the goals to ensure sustained solutions, the new partnership models developing across the world, improved legislation, and of course the leadership of Pope Francis, we again have a real opportunity to fight back against this cruel trade in human life. As a result, us here and globally, our responsibilities have never been greater. Thank you.